I wouldn't say the Analogue Pocket is my most anticipated console of all time, though it's certainly the one for which I've shown the most patience. When it was announced back in 2019, I immediately knew I'd be ordering one. Having already purchased two of their consoles, I was well familiar with not only the build quality of Analogue systems, but also the extreme love and care that went into their accuracy thanks to in-depth videos from the likes of My Life in Gaming and Digital Foundry. So when they went live for pre-order in the August of 2020, I made sure to be at the ready, keenly aware of how quickly they'd likely sell out. Luckily I got mine in early, and nearly 18 months later it arrived in December, complete with the dock and Game Gear adapter. So more than 2 years after its initial announcement, was it worth the wait? Well, let's find out. As usual, unboxing the unit itself was an experience not too far removed from an Apple product. The packaging is severe in its matte black finish and feels appropriately premium for the device it contains. Predictably, the second you lay eyes on the unit, it's clearly in a league of its own as far as clone systems go. No, it isn't carved out of a single block of aluminum, but the plastic housing feels solid in that OG Game Boy sort of way. And if you're skeptical of the build quality of that system, remember, Nintendo itself kept an original Game Boy that was toasted by an IED during the Gulf War on display in its New York store. Naturally, I wouldn't recommend doing any drop tests and certainly not setting your own Pocket on fire, but the screen does boast some Gorilla Glass which raises the profile a bit, but with the added benefit of the sort of durability you'd find on a premium smartphone. It's clear they engineered it to take at least the sort of beating it might suffer knocking around in your backpack or, well, pocket. Beyond the plastic housing and protective glass, the Pocket sports a 3.5-inch 1600 by 1440 LCD, which provides a staggering clarity. That's a PPI density of 615, which, for comparison's sake, the iPhone 13 Pro Max has a PPI of 458. But raw specs aside, seeing is believing, and while I've done my best to capture the clarity here, no amount of fancy B-roll is going to do it justice. I've just never seen games from my childhood brought up to modern standards in such an attention-grabbing way. Sure, you can emulate games on any number of modern displays, but seeing a device of this caliber designed down to the literal metal with the singular aim of preserving the original experience, complete with display modes that mirror those original systems, is really inspiring. But the screen doesn't matter so much if the controls aren't responsive, and I'm happy to report they very much are. The four primary face buttons, 2 convex, 2 concave, have just the right amount of response. Not too mushy, not too clicky, just Goldilocks all around. Similarly, the D-pad feels excellent, and after putting it through its paces on a variety of genres, the only incorrect inputs I could confirm were due to my own lack of skill in fighting games. For the most common genres I personally play through, I couldn't find an instance where my on-screen actions weren't reflective of the input I was feeding it. Around the rear of the system you'll find the shoulder buttons, and just like the face buttons, they strike a good balance of tactile response. They might take a little more force to pull than I'd like, but considering your grip will naturally land your index fingers here, it's probably better that they not activate too easily. Outside of the standard 4-face, 2-shoulder, and start select buttons, there's an analog button right at the bottom to quickly get to your settings, or you can hold it and cycle the D-pad left and right to change display modes. Or you can hold the analog button and hit up or down to save and load states, which is really helpful, though at present these states only last while you have the cartridge in and during sleep modes. Speaking of, you'll find the sleep and power button on the left-hand side right beneath the volume rocker, which can also be used to adjust the screen brightness. These are very nearly flush with the system, which can take a little getting used to. Also, it's something to be mindful of if you're a weirdo like me who prefers to rest your index fingers on the side of the unit for a better grip. Speaking of grip, I have to say the textured back was a really nice touch, both practically and as a nod to the rear of the OG Game Boy. As comfort goes, if you're the type who prefers your controls to fall directly beneath the screen rather than having them flank the sides of the display, the Pocket fits like a glove. I think this is helped by the form factor being larger than I was expecting. From the pictures, I kind of thought it would be closer in size to the Game Boy Pocket, but instead it hits a nice middle ground between the Game Boy and the Game Boy Pocket. Naturally, depending on your hand size, you might find this a little more or a little less comfortable, but practically speaking, I'm sure this also allowed for a beefier battery to be housed within. And while you can't just pop off the rear panel with a tab to swap out some AA's, you can get to the user replaceable battery without much trouble should you ever need to replace it. Included is a 4300 mAh battery that should last you from 6 to 10 hours. I didn't measure the exact time it took to drain the battery. Under most normal conditions, you shouldn't have any trouble getting a full day's enjoyment out of it without the need for a recharge. Beyond the form factor and controls, it also sports a microSD card slot on the right side of the unit, which is used for software updates and, eventually, saving screenshots and other data. At the bottom you'll find a USB-C port for charging, an original link cable port, a power indicator/infrared transceiver, and a 3.5mm headphone jack. Although I will say that the stereo speakers on the side of the unit sound fantastically loud and clear. Firing up the Analogue Pocket presents a Spartan but flexible OS. Well, after you scroll through a pretty long EULA anyways. From the main menu of the OS, you can choose to play cartridge, tools, and settings. Digging into the settings, you can modify the startup behavior if you'd like, so the system boots directly into the cartridge you have inserted, but I just left it at the default. There are also options for library and memories, though at launch you'll find that these options are grayed out. Eventually, as Analogue OS evolves, these will become available, allowing you to track your collection with a full reference database that includes things like publisher information or cover art, and also enable you to make playlists of your favorite games. The memory section should be for managing your save states and screenshots, but again, these features will show up sometime later, and you can keep an eye on analogue.co/os for update information. Speaking of updates, there was an update of 1.0a that I downloaded and installed before ramping up, and those can be found on the Analogue site as well. Doing this requires a micro SD card, and since it doesn't include one, you'll definitely want to make sure to grab one of those if you don't have one lying around. After copying the file to the root of the card and popping it in, and then powering it up, the update was installed automatically. But don't worry, if you accidentally put it in the wrong spot or encounter any issues, Analogue's documentation states that you can't brick your system through a firmware update, so no need for panic. Beyond the initial setup and launching a game, the tools section includes Nanoloop for making music, which honestly I only briefly played around with as I'm no musician, and then it also includes GB Studio, which will let you load homebrew games onto the SD card if you want to play some Game Boy games that are being developed in the modern age. But when you're not playing games, you'll probably spend most of your time in the settings menu, where you can tweak various options for each of the systems that the Pocket can handle. This includes things like the default display modes, size and position, frame blending, and so on. Now personally, I'm not a graphics expert, so I didn't spend a ton of time tweaking these since it looks pretty stellar right out of the box. However, I definitely encourage you to check out My Life in Gaming's video on the Pocket, because they do a much deeper dive into these technical options, and it's definitely worth checking out. The most common options I explored for the individual console settings were enabling Super Game Boy mode for the buttons, which makes it a little more ergonomic for your right thumb to rock between A and B. It can be a little confusing at first since none of them are labeled, but if you've played retro games in any capacity recently, you'll adapt to it quickly. So if the controls feel a little odd to you, just enable this option. The other most common option that I accessed was to force Game Boy mode when I wanted the game I was playing to think it was in an original Game Boy rather than a Game Boy Color, for example. But to wrap this up and get to the fun stuff, rest assured the menu is well laid out and easy to understand, with a range of options for the most common tweaks you'd like to make for your handheld gaming experience. So, hardware and software aside, how is, actually playing games on this thing? Absolutely brilliant. At this point, I've probably popped in a few dozen cartridges across the Game Boy Color, and Game Boy Advance libraries, and have had almost no issues so far. The only times I encounter problems with running games is when I admittedly needed to clean a few, and when I did, they ran exactly as I remembered and expected them to run. Input lag is non-existent, and it's so cool to swap between Analogue's pixel-perfect mode and the display modes that mirror the original hardware. Cool and honestly a little shocking to look at how muted the color palette was on the original Game Boy Advance compared to the GBA SP101, let alone pixel-perfect mode, which is just retina-searing vivid by comparison. Visual fidelity aside, this thing is just so comfortable to hold and play, particularly if you weren't a fan of the Game Boy Advance SP's form factor, which, while I love the clamshell design for its practical screen protection, the L and R buttons always felt a little cramped for my taste. Although I will say that I do prefer the slightly clickier feel of that system's L and R buttons. Of course, you can avoid the Pocket's buttons altogether if you opt to play with a controller and you've purchased the optional dock. I did have to update the firmware on this as well before I could use it, but had no problems pairing my Berry Blue DualShock 4 with it. Some of the display settings are stripped out in dock mode, but it's capable of fast charging your Pocket, supports wireless and USB connected controllers, and outputs at a maximum of 1080p. Like the Pocket itself, the dock will also be periodically updated, however, so I'd expect even more features to become available as time goes on. But regardless of how you choose to play, I have to say it was an absolute joy firing up cartridges that I hadn't touched in years, or literal decades in some cases, and finding my save data there waiting for me. And all of it behaving exactly the way it would have on those systems. It cracked me up to see the slowdown of Star Saver just like I remember it, and I marveled at how great of a game Super Mario Bros. Deluxe really was on the Game Boy Color. I pawed through every loose cartridge in my collection and immediately started looking at what was missing from my current library. My love for those early portables reignited in full now that I could play them on ostensibly original hardware that's been beefed up to the max. And after all of that, I have to say that's the real takeaway from the Analogue Pocket for me. It doesn't feel at all like just another clone system, nor does it feel like just a supercharged Game Boy. The care with which Analogue has treated these systems and their legacy shines through in every area, from providing true-to-source display options to the exhaustive documentation. Documentation that even takes into account the rare player who might try to pop in a copy of Burai Fighter or Road Rash, not knowing that they would need to force original Game Boy mode for it to run properly. This slavish attention to detail is woven throughout the entire Analogue Pocket experience. And approaching something as seemingly innocuous as old video games with this level of care shows exactly the kind of commitment you only get from a true labor of love. So if you're on the fence about it and you have a whole mountain of loose cards that will never leave your collection, you owe it to yourself to take the leap, even if you might have to wait a while for it to arrive. Because speaking as someone who waited 501 days for it to get here, I regret that decision exactly not at all. Now, I've spent most of this review talking about older cards from my collection, but naturally with hardware that's this good, I've been feverishly tracking down a range of old and new titles to play on it. So if you want to see more of the Analogue Pocket in action along with some of the newer acquisitions from my collection thanks to the Analogue Pocket, make sure you stay tuned for the next video where I'm going to go over some titles that I'm exploring for the first time, and some classics that I was able to re-add to my collection just recently. As always, thank you so much for your time and watching these videos. Have an amazing day, and I'll see you on the next one. Bye.